I'd like to get started, and I'm Jay Bonner. I'll just give you a very brief background of how I come to this. I'm a design consultant. I'm a specialist in Islamic ornament, specializing in geometric art. I also do floral art, and I design ornaments primarily for architecture. And I'm very happy to be here, and what I'm going to be speaking about today is this particular methodology that uses underlying polygonal grids or tessellations in order to derive patterns from. And this is very much in line with what the earlier workshop by Gusan was talking about. And I was speaking about this very quickly the other day on Monday. But this is going to be a more in-depth look at this particular methodology, which I call the Polygonal Technique. Other people have called it other things. Primarily, people are calling it polygons in contact. Speaking just quickly about terminology, I prefer the terminology of the Polygonal Technique because polygons in contact is a very static idea. It's just polygons in contact, but it doesn't describe that being something that creates something else. And this is very much a case where a tessellation creates a pattern, and so there's a process involved. Hi. So let me see if this is working. Good. So I showed these images the other day. I am going to speak very briefly with a little bit of a historical introduction, even though I spoke about the history previously. I'm going to just recap a little tiny bit. And what I want to say is that you see in these two early images from the earliest period, Umayyad and Abbasid period of Islam, that there was a part of the overall geometric aesthetic in those early centuries involved the use of polygonal structures, polygonal tessellations. And so the reason I want to remind everybody of this is that clearly polygonal tessellations were a part of the artistic vocabulary of the time. So throughout the Islamic world at that early time, polygonal networks were being used ornamentally. And so the reason I mention this is that it's important that we all understand that artists were familiar with polygonal tessellations. It was a part of their vocabulary of art forms. And the reason that is significant is that at some point in time, it was discovered or realized that if you take areas in the network, let's say the midpoints, this is a key feature, and you connect lines from the midpoints, you can create a secondary design, a secondary pattern on top of the polygonal network. Both of these two networks will make beautiful, more conventional Islamic geometric patterns. And so at some point, as I said, an artist or a mathematician, we don't really know who, but at some point, someone had the epiphany to apply secondary lines on top of the lines, saw something beautiful, and dispensed with the underlying, at this point now, underlying network, and only kept the resulting pattern. So it's impossible to say just when this happened. It could have happened very early on because some of the earliest patterns can be made in this way. But I do want to emphasize something that Jean-Marc said earlier, and that is that many of these patterns, especially the earlier ones and especially the less complex ones, can be made in multiple different ways. And so I'm a proponent of the polygonal technique. Thank you. That's just about perfect. I'm a proponent of the polygonal technique, but that's not to say that I don't believe the other techniques have historical merit. But one of the reasons that I'm a proponent of this technique is that it's so very, very versatile. It's the most versatile of all the techniques. It's capable of doing the most, especially with the least amount of information. So, in talking about the polygonal technique, there are two branches or two disciplines in the polygonal technique. There's the discipline that is a systematic approach and a non-systematic approach. And what do I mean by that? The systematic approach uses repetitive modules, which are called polygons. It uses individual polygons, and those polygons can create an infinite number of tessellations. You can go on and on. There's so many possibilities. And when you apply pattern lines onto those innumerable tessellations, you get innumerable patterns. So this is a modular system, as Reza has phrased it. It uses modularity. Each system has a finite number of shapes that can be rearranged in different configurations to make different geometric patterns. By contrast, let me first just mention, so of the systematic, in the systematic branch of this discipline, I have identified 5 different historical systems that have been used. The first of which might appear to be the simplest, but it has some of the most beautiful patterns, and it uses the regular polygons. That's the triangle, the square, the hexagon, the octagon, and the dodecagon. And so this is, I usually refer to this as the system of regular polygons. Then there's another system that uses squares and octagons. And then those are the 2 regular shapes, but then it has a whole range of non-regular polygons. Non-regular means that it doesn't have the same angles. If it's a pentagon, it's not a regular pentagon with 108 degrees, the interior angle, but it will have a series of different angles that fit with the matrix with the tessellating matrix. And you're going to see some examples in a little bit. And then there's another 4/8 system, another system that uses octagons that I call the 4/8 system B. So there's 4/8 system A, 4/8 system B. The parts don't interchange. They're two separate systems. They make very indicative families of patterns. Each of these systems makes patterns that are very recognizable to the system. They're very different from one another. And so then there's a 5-fold system. We've seen a lot of in this program. You see a lot of them throughout the Muslim world. And these are the beautiful patterns with regular pentagons and with decagonal stars, decagrams, and it's a whole nother family of patterns. And then finally there's a 714 system. Gussen's program earlier, just prior to lunch, at the end of it he spoke about a splendid pattern from Isfahan, from the Masjid-i-Jami. And this is one of the earliest examples of a pattern created from the sevenfold system. The sevenfold system is the most obscure. You can count all of the sevenfold patterns throughout the Islamic world on maybe 4 hands or something like that. There aren't very many of them. In fact, I'm going to show you most of the ones that there are. You'll see some slides. So these are these systems. The great thing about systematic patterns is that they offer a very immediate way of creating a wide range of patterns. They're really friendly for creation. They naturally lead to an abundance of pattern making. Non-systematic patterns, by contrast, have they also use a tessellating matrix, an underlying subgrid. Sometimes I refer to it, but an underlying generative tessellation. Let's call it that, an underlying generative tessellation. But the elements in that do not reassemble. The individual polygons are not modular. That's the key difference. The individual polygons in the tessellation are not modular. You can't take them out of the tessellation and reassemble them into other arrangements. They just won't work. They're specific to that tessellation and that tessellation alone. And we're going to talk about those in more detail. One of the nice things about the polygonal technique, before I move on, is that from the polygonal technique, and by placing crossing pattern lines upon the center points of the polygonal edges, by placing crossing pattern lines, you can change the angle of those crossing pattern lines. And you can change it so the contact angle is more acute, sharper, and you can open it up and change it to be quite obtuse. And you can also have it somewhere in the middle. You can also, instead of using the the pattern lines placed at the midpoints of the polygonal edges, you can also place them on 2 points on each polygonal edge. And that's another family of patterns that I call 2-point patterns. So there are, throughout the Islamic world, from Morocco to India, there are 4 families of patterns that can be made from this methodology. And I call them acute, median, obtuse, and 2-point. So the nice thing about both systematic patterns and non-systematic patterns is that any one polygonal grid or polygonal tessellation will create 4 patterns. And just while we're talking about diversity and multiplicity, any one of those patterns can have applied variation to get even more diversity. This is something that Jean-Marc was talking about earlier this morning, as and how the star, a 10-pointed star, can be infilled. In Emil Makavicki was saying also a 10-pointed star can be infilled in different ways. It can be left open, or it can be closed or filled in. So even when you have these 4 different patterns that are being created from one grid, any one of those 4 patterns can have further added variation. So suddenly it becomes a whole vast range of potentiality just from one polygonal grid. And I will now recap a little bit what I was saying the other day. And it's important, I think, for me to emphasize the historicity of this technique, because many of you in this room are artists, designers, architects, and are interested in furthering your skills with geometric art. And it's really good to know, key to that obviously is methodology. You have to have a working practice to end up with a good result. And there are many methodologies, and I don't want to disparage any of the methodologies. They all have their strengths. Some have their weaknesses, but really only the polygonal technique is rooted, well, not only, but it is of the various techniques, it is the one technique that has the most historical evidence for its use. There are myriad examples of its use. And so the reason I want to talk about this is so that when you practice this, when you put it into practice, and it's easily learned, when you put it into practice, I want everybody to know that you're engaged in a practice that has tremendous historical precedence. That you're working in a discipline that many people have worked in before, and that you're part of a continuity. So one of the types of evidence is architectural, and here's a Mamluk example from the Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo. Here's a Mughal piece from Chisti's tomb in Fatehpur Sikri, and here's another. This is, by the way, the 4-fold system B. This is the 5-fold system, 5-10 system, 4-8 system B, and this is a non-regular, non-systematic example. So now another source of evidence is from Quranic illuminations. This is a frontispiece from a Mamluk Quran, and if you look very carefully with oblique light source, if the light is at an oblique angle, it will create little shadows. And in this green line, there are little grooves from the stylus, from the artist who laid out the page. He drew little lines with a steel tip in order to guide the illumination, the making of the pattern. And so you don't see it when you just look at it, but if you look at it under certain lighting conditions, you see this underlying tessellation. So that's another source. And then, of course, design scrolls are critical. Source of information of overwhelmingly most important is the Topkapi Scroll, which has so many examples of geometric designs, both systematic and non-systematic. And of the systematic ones, it does not have any sevenfold, but it has 5 fourfold A, fourfold B, and the system of regular polygons, so it's represented as well. So the Topkapi Scroll is immensely important. Just quick parenthetical personal note. I came upon this system of making patterns before I had even seen Islamic art in any books or traveled to the Middle East or North Africa. I was still just a teenager. I was a young person, and my father is a chemist. He was a professor of chemistry, and chemists will often use plastic template, and in the plastic template are cut little openings for different polygons, and the polygons are used by the chemists to draw molecules. It's a quick way of conceptualizing chemical molecules. So I had this template of my father's, and I started playing around with drawing networks of polygons and turning them into grids, and some of them were eccentric with, you know, a 9-sided polygon with pentagons around it, and the pentagons don't quite fit, but you can make them, you know, overlap a little bit. And then I started drawing lines on top of that grid and creating patterns. And then, so when I first saw my first examples of Islamic design, I was astonished because I saw that this had been done before. So I have this, I have a sort of a long time fondness for this, because it's something that I've sort of discovered myself. When I discovered it myself, I thought this must be the way it was done. It's so simple. It works so easily. It's so immediate. And there were no books in those days telling you how to make patterns, nothing at all. And so when I came to Istanbul in 1986 for work, for a business, to meet with some manufacturers here, I went to the Topkapi like any tourist would, and the Topkapi Scroll was on display. I was so fortunate, and it was all laid out under glass, big long display, and I saw this, and I was completely arrested, because it was a confirmation that the techniques that I had been working with were in fact used traditionally. And I'm also going to just mention quickly the anonymous manuscript, because we've heard quite a bit about it. This is the Congruent Figures manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and it has many examples of step-by-step constructions for geometric designs, but with only a few exceptions, the designs are pretty simple designs, and this is one of the more interesting ones for sure. This is also the only one that shows a polygonal grid for its construction. It's showing these elements that correspond, the midpoints correspond to the crossing pattern lines. So this is also a source of evidence, but it's an interesting one because it's only one out of many, many examples that actually shows the underlying grid. The others do not. I'm not convinced that it's as important to the question of methodology that is generally accepted. I think that it's possibly the work of a mathematician who was studying the environment around him and making notes and trying to work out how these craftsmen did what they did. I'm not so sure that it was made specifically to teach craftsmen, because quite frankly, the instructions for making the figures are not always very good, and they wouldn't lead to the easy making of a rather simple design. So I'm not so convinced, but I'm very happy to be corrected. And then the last piece of evidence is what I talked about the other day, is Hankins' work in India, where he saw firsthand, while he was in India in the late 20th century, he saw the late 19th century, he saw a plaster facade, actually a partial dome, of a geometric pattern that had collapsed, and underneath it you could see the polygonal network that the pattern had been made from, and he has reported on this, and he's really the first person in the world to publish on this technique. He didn't ever name the technique. The oftentimes used description for this technique of polygons in contact come from a phrase from his manuscript, but he didn't actually name it, but he described it in tremendous detail. Okay, so now to get to the systems. Now, I'm going to be handing out a bunch of material that's supposed to arrive at any minute, and one of the things you're going to get is this. This is the system of regular polygons. I've taken the liberty of putting the pattern lines on it for ease. When you, if and when you want, you can use the printed A4 sheet that you'll have. It won't have the color, but it has all of the polygons with all of the pattern lines on it. And one easy way to play around with this is to get a piece of tracing paper or even a piece of lightweight bond and lay it on top, trace the polygon. You don't have to use a straight edge. Just trace the polygon carefully, draw the pattern lines carefully, and then shift the paper and trace again, and you can start playing. Another thing you could do is to take this sheet and photocopy it a bunch of times and cut out the pieces and put them together, but quite frankly they're small and they'll move around and it'll be a bit of a nuisance. It's easier to trace. So what we have here are, let me first mention, in this particular system, there's the greatest amount of variability of different kinds of applications of pattern line. There's so many different things. In the other systems, there's not so many. You know, if there's a pentagon, in the fivefold system, there's basically 4 conventions for decorating the pentagon. In the system of regular polygons, there's much more variability. And one of the reasons I think this is the case, when you look at the historical patterns that can be made from this system, is that these are early patterns from the 11th century, even some from the 10th century, but mostly from the 11th, 12th, 13th century, and when this system was coming to maturity. And in those early days, there was a lot of play, a lot of experimentation. And so this kind of diversity of line applications, I think, represents that. Sometimes they use the word form finding, of sort of trying to move forward and see what these different things do aesthetically. So you see it's triangles, squares, hexagons, and dodecagons. What's missing here are octagons, and the reason they're missing, I'll just say quickly, is that octagons will only tessellate with a square when you're talking about regular polygons, and that's a whole different group of patterns that I've, for the purposes of brevity, I have overlooked in this. So I haven't put the 8 up here because of that reason. And so one of the hallmarks of this system is that it tessellates in so many different ways. It tessellates on the triangular grid, here. It will use a elongated hexagonal repeat right here. This is a square repeat with rotation symmetry. Another orthogonal, another square, another isometric one. And so these pieces will make patterns that repeat on a square as well as repeat on a hexagon or triangle, and even ones that work on rectangles and hexagons, as you can see. So it symmetrically offers a lot of variability. The other systems tend to be fixed, 5-fold, 4-fold, 7-fold, but this system has greater diversity in its symmetry types. And so these ones here, by the way, are semi-regular, which is to say they're not regular because they have more than one type of polygon, but they're semi-regular because they have the same vertice. This is a 3-6-3-6, triangle, hexagon, etc., etc. So every vertice on each of these is identical to every other vertice. So there are only 8 of these. That sounds very limiting, but when you go to tessellations that have 2 different types of vertex, which demi-regular, or more elegantly called 2 uniform tessellations, these have, as they imply, 2 uniform. They have 2 varieties, and I've just shown these 12. There are many, many more. It was someone proposed the idea that there were 22 or something. Actually, technically there are infinite number. You can, just for example, you can take this one here, and with the same number of vertices, you could, instead of putting 3 triangles, you could put 4 or 5 or 6 and have the hexagon move outward further and farther apart infinitely. So really, technically, there are an infinite number of these. And that's only for that one grid, for other grids too. So those are 2 uniform. Each of these will make very interesting patterns, as you'll see in a minute. I'm not going to show you ones from all of them, but you'll see. And then there are also 3 uniforms, where there are 3 types of vertex, and these are just 4 examples. Now you're into a world where there's tremendous diversity. I've only showing you these. So now I'm going to show you some patterns, and I'm showing you these particular patterns for 2 reasons. One is to kind of show an approach to the design process, and also just to mention that each of these sequence of patterns I'm showing right now, the finished patterns, are original constructions. They don't exist, as far as I know, in the historic record. This isn't so interesting. That's rather nice. This could be nice under certain circumstances. But the point is that this tessellation will, the reason I'm showing this talk isn't to talk about my own work, but I want to show that it's possible to use, with simple logical geometry and application of pattern lines, very simplistic, you can move to something that's really beautiful and is really completely original. You can all do this very easily, and you can create things that are very nice. I mean, that one in the upper right, it wouldn't surprise me to find that in a building. It's a very successful design. It marries with the aesthetics of the tradition. So in this one, we're just applying 60-degree angles. It couldn't be simpler. Triangles go inside triangles, and the 6-pointed star goes inside the hexagon. Then you just extend the lines out, and very soon, I think it's coming right now. Yeah? Excellent. Thank you. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. So much here. So, I hope they're collated. They are. Excellent. It's 4. They're collated, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. And then by contrast, this one here is the very same tessellation. It's the same tessellation. This one I've started it by putting squares inside the squares, and then you can see the sequence. And these are just 2 examples, or actually 3 examples of how these can be done. So many more are possible. So many more. So here's another. Is that the same tessellation? Yeah. This is the same tessellation again. It's the same grid. And by putting octagons inside of the squares instead of squares inside the squares, I put octagons inside the squares as a starting point. I've extended the lines outward. This is a very nice design. And but it doesn't appear in the historic record so far as I know. It could well. I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that I've never found it. But you can see how easily it's developed. And then this is a 2-point pattern. It uses 2 points on each edge. You see right here, 2 points. And it's connecting parallel to the edges of the square. And it's using points that are 1/4. If you divide this line into 4 pieces, this is 1/4 and that's 1/4. And it's just extending them, putting those on each square, extending them in, and voila, you get this very nice design. Again, these have, so far as I know, they're not in the historic record. This is a little bit of an unusual tessellation, but very nice, and it speaks for itself. Again, adding triangles into the triangular positions, squares into the square positions, extending the lines inward until they meet each other, and you get these two designs. These are very similar to designs in the historic record, but they're ahistorical. So have a little look at that and see what's going on for a minute.
Each person 4 pages. Each person 4 pages.
Thank you so much. And what I've got here are 3 pages of grids that are made from the system of regular polygons. Yeah.
Please, if you are speaker, do it on this. Don't go.
Oh, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned, because could I just say, everybody, I'm leaving my PDF files. These are PDF files. I'm leaving them here at the Design Center. So if anybody wants, if you use one of these and it gets messy and you want to get access to it again, it will always be here at the Design Center. All of these, I've got lots and lots of stuff here to give you all. It's all going to be here for your ongoing availability. And also, the PowerPoint, all of this imagery that I'm showing you, this PowerPoint is going to be, it will stay here at the Design Center, and you're all welcome to that as well. So if you want access to this information beyond today, it's available. And this is, so now this is again the same, this is the same unusual tessellation of decagons, triangles, and squares. And now on this top one, I've started the pattern. I've established my starting point by putting octagons in the squares. A very simple, logical thing to do. Octagons inside of squares fits beautifully. So octagons inside of squares, I then extend the lines. I fill in my decagons in a way that's aesthetically pleasing. There are conventions for this. It's too much to go in right now, but there are many conventions for how we do the rosette. And then you end up with what's really quite an acceptable design, despite the fact it's never been seen in the historic record. Similarly, this one here, now we're starting with these crosses, the parallel crossing lines on the 2-point, and extending the lines in. Look at the beautiful double hexagons right here. And this pattern, I'm especially fond of this pattern. I think it's a beautiful pattern, but it's not known historically. So all of you are able to do this. You can all make patterns. It stops being important whether it's new or not. What's only really important is if it's beautiful or not. And so, and this will make beautiful patterns quite quickly. Thank you.
Can I ask something?
Yes, please.
Is there, for example, you have about the square, is there a limited number of patterns you can fill the square, or is it infinite?
This is what I'm glad you asked that, because it's really for you to find the limits. I mean, okay. That's a poor way of saying that. I wouldn't say it's infinite, but it's not regimented. It's more regimented in the other systems, but in this system, there's so many possibilities that and each possibility creates a different kind of aesthetic. So it's really kind of cool.
You just have to try it out.
Just try it out, and sometimes try it with a compass and do curvilinear work. You know, I mean, it's really completely open to experimenting and to the creative process. Now what you have one of the things you have in exercise 1, or what you have in exercise 1, are 2 grids, just 2 to make it so that you can try some different things. And I wanted to give you this because it's about the simplest, just simple grid of hexagons. That's pretty basic, isn't it? It's just a grid of hexagons. You wouldn't think that there's so much you could do with just a simple grid of hexagons. Oh my God, it's so great what you can do with hexagons. So here's obviously an acute pattern, and you'll see, we're going to stop in just a couple of minutes, and you're going to work on the hexagons and see. But let me just explain a little bit or show you some examples. So here's an example of a very sort of hyperacute. Whoa, what's happening there? And this is using the six-pointed star, very well known, nice examples in the windows down at the mosque next door. Here's a median pattern with 45 degrees. Very well-known pattern. You see it everywhere in the Islamic world. Each of these patterns is very historical, except this one. This is, anyway. This is like a threefold basket weave, also extremely common. If you take these lines here and widen them to the vertices of the underlying grid, and they can't go any wider than that. They can't go beyond their limitation, because if they're all three sides being widened equally, they end up at that point and they stop. They can't move any further. And then you get this tight, sort of a tight, closed version of this design. These are all, okay, so that's 6 designs. But look at all of these two-point patterns. These are all historical. These all come from the historic record. They all are simply made from the hexagonal grid. In this case, using 2 points of that grid. And I encourage you, if you are interested in having a chance to sort of see this more closely, you can have access to the PowerPoint. It will be left here so that you can come back and you can look at these slides, other slides, if you want. It's too much to try and assimilate, and so quickly I'm showing you an awful lot of material. But yeah, this one here is also in the mosque next door. When you're walking through the courtyard, if you look at the entrance, you'll see a wooden door with that lovely design on it. And now there's another type of pattern that's made from hexagons, which just goes to show the variability, the kind of flexible approach that the artists took to deriving patterns from grids. And in this case, the artist has chosen to treat the blue hexagons in one fixed way and the gray hexagons in a secondary way. This has got full use of the midpoints. All 6 midpoints are being utilized. In this case, only 4 of the midpoints are being utilized. It makes a splendid design. So they were clever. They were thinking, okay, what can we do? And they're thinking, okay, let's just emphasize, give dominance of some hexagons over others. And this does the same thing. In this case, again, the same 6-pointed stars, but they've treated this line, this hexagon in the pattern itself, by being perpendicular to the midpoint of the line of the underlying tessellating grid. Really beautiful pattern. I love that pattern. And its beauty speaks for itself. These are the same again. Two more from the exact same dominant passive use of the pentagons. This is a 2-point pattern. This one has the same 6-pointed stars. These are all historical. I haven't bothered putting the places. I'm sorry. It would be all that much. There's enough information going on. All of these are in this book I'm writing that should be out will be out in 2014. And in the book, of course, everything is attributed to its location. Now, this is the 3-6-3-6 tessellation. You can see the myriad designs that this creates very simply. Starting with a triangle, and it's very simple how that's made. You can just sort of see. You just go through the midpoints. It's a series of parallel lines, and then you just erase out, making the openings for the stars. This does essentially the same thing, but with 90-degree angles. This does the same thing, but with 120-degree angles. And these are all lovely historical designs. It's interesting that this group of 5 right here, it just so happens that this grid lends itself to making patterns with closed elements. Closed hexagon, closed irregular hexagon, closed dodecagon, and another hexagon. This one is not, but it's interesting in its own way. There's only one variety of line type in 3 different directions, and it weaves together in that quite beautiful way. Now, they also treated this particular grid with positive or active and passive cells. In this case, the active cells are the turquoise and the orange, and the passive cells are the white and gray. And you can see that that's another treatment that was very successful in making a variety of lovely historical patterns. So when you're doing this, you know, be free to try something different that I'm not talking about. You know, sort of, as they say, think outside the box. A terribly overused phrase, but somehow apt. And then in this case, again, negative or passive areas and active areas. It's not the same as the last one. It's the same underlying grid, but it's different areas of passivity and activity. This is the design that was produced by the Ghaznavids and in the mid 11th century, and then 100 years later it was used in Jerusalem. And you know, this design made its way from, it's interesting because Jerusalem, of course, was on the pilgrim route, and sort of my romantic mind wants to speculate that perhaps it was carried westward to Jerusalem by either traders or pilgrims, but who knows? Or artists, very more likely. And then here again, the same activity and passivity. Here we have a design that in and of itself is nice, but then the artist added this, sort of arbitrarily added this dodecagon and creating this rather nice design as well. Okay, so now here we have this well-known pattern. This is a very well-known pattern. It's made so simply, and it's isometric. It repeats with triangles or hexagons, depending upon where you measure from. And a very well-known piece from a Mamluk manuscript where it's been attributed, or rather applied curved lines, curvilinear lines. Another thing you can do while you're working with this is to, like I referenced a moment ago, is to work with a compass. And then these are more examples. You get these different types of infill. This is a very common way of elaborating or bringing personal expression or cultural expression. This is more of a Moroccan way of dealing with the central area. In fact, very much a Moroccan way. You wouldn't see this in Iran. So each culture had its own way of bringing added design, additive design elements into the work, giving it a kind of a distinct cultural quality. And then similar to the last, but working on a square grid and with squares, is this well-known design. And you have exercise 3. Is this right here, and that is the same tessellation. And on these, you will have noticed, I'm not telling you anything you can't just see for yourself, but you'll notice that the midpoints and the third points, I've divided each polygonal edge into half and into thirds, so that when you're working, and I've also put all the radii down, because sometimes it's useful to have the radii when you're drawing across. If you don't want to go all the way across, you can stop a little early, knowing that you're in a good spot. So this grid will make, you know, as all of them do, will make a large number of very nice designs. We're going to get to some exercises in just a sec, but before I close this portion, so then there are also these designs that have this shield shape, or these tessellations that have this shield shape. Now that's not a regular polygon. It's a hexagon that is interesting. It's got 3 90-degree angles, which are very characteristic. It's basically 3 squares of the same size that are point to point rotated around. It's so it's technically not a regular polygon, but it tessellates with the regular polygon so elegantly that that it's appropriate to include it in this particular system. You can do a lot of different combinations. Only 1 or 2 of these have been used historically. In fact, yeah, only these 2, as far as I know, have been used historically. That's one of the examples. That's a historic example. I think that Eric Burg did an analysis with you all of this particular design, and that's another one that's been used historically, including here in Turkey. And in this case, look at how the triangles, or let's go back one. look at how the triangles inform this irregular pentagon, hexagon. There's no mystery to it whatsoever. They just make themselves. Nobody has to think, how do I get those lines in there to be, regular and to work nicely? Well, you just continue the lines from the hexagon, and it completely makes itself. So quickly before we get to the exercise, so then these systems lend themselves to making patterns with dual levels, or with two levels. These dual level patterns, I usually refer to them as dual level. They have self-similar characteristics. Some of them are truly self-similar. Others have self-similar characteristics. By that I mean that the elements that make up the primary pattern, here a very bold six-fold pattern, this really bold pattern. These are the backgrounds, of course. And then you're infilling the background area with elements from the same system that makes this. So as you're using the same elements from the same system, but at a reduced scale, and then ending up with another pattern. So here's the first exercise I'd like to ask you to attend to, if you could. And my sort of approach, perhaps unlike others thus far in this, is to give you more than you can deal with. So I'm asking you to not try and do all of these, but choose one that you think is nice, or maybe two that you think is nice for the next few minutes, and focus on that, if it be this one, or if it be this one, whichever one it might be, to populate a cell with it and move to the next cell. And the next cell, actually, if it's this one here, you'll see one line will go through the midpoints all the way. But choose one of these and one or two of them, and you've got an upper and a lower group of them. So do a couple of them. Don't worry about filling it all in. What I'd like you to do at first is just to fill in 1, 2, or 3 with whichever one you choose to use, and then move to the next one underneath and do the same thing with one of the other ones. And then we'll move on to the next image, and you can come back to these so this will sort of get you at the first start. And if you're more comfortable using freehand instead of a straight edge, that's perfectly fine because it will work very nicely. And what I will do is I'll circulate, and please ask any questions. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hi. And I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a added aspect, and of course, many of the times when you see these patterns, they have wider lines, they have thicker lines, and the lines interweave with each other over and under. And we're not really going to go into that right now, but it's often asked, how do you determine how wide to make the line? And since we have these convenient midpoints, or these 2-point divisions, it's possible also to take what you're doing right now and to use the little 2-point divisions and make parallel lines to the lines that you're drawing right now. You can take those lines that you're drawing right now, and you can make parallel lines that bisect the 1/3 divisions, the 2-point divisions, like these 2 points right here. And then you get this widened, in each case, not this one because it's so tight, but you get this a double line or thicker line. And then later on, you can use an eraser or trace over it to go over, under, over, under, over, under. We won't do that right now, but this is a convenient way. And you might want to just take one element, whatever you're drawing, whichever one you're doing. You just might take one of those and create the double line to remind you that this is a way of establishing an interweaving form of the pattern. So I'm going to now move on to the next exercise 2. So if people could turn to exercise 2. And the idea here is that you can come at your leisure you can finish these. That's what I was saying. My tendency is to give too much, and so rather than doing a finished design right now, we're going to move through a series of partial designs, and so that you can bring these home with you and finish them when you have time. And also, by the way, if I might forget to mention that on these sheets at the bottom is my name and my email. And if you're doing work and if you have a pattern that you like and you don't think you've ever seen it before and you're happy with it and you want feedback from me, if you scan it and email it to me, I'm very happy to reply. So now on to exercise 2. You'll see that I put once again into a rectangle, whereas right in here you're only really seeing a part of what you have, but it's the same information. It's the same grid, the same generating tessellation. And so what I'd like you to do is draw in one area on one of the 4 triangles inside the triangles. And if you extend the lines to these radii, so you're drawing this form right here. If you do that in just a few of the spots, not everywhere, but just a few of the spots on one of these, that's all the information you need to then create really quite a lovely pattern. Just by drawing these triangles in here. So if you take like in the upper left-hand side, and if you work in the triangular areas and draw a triangle inside a triangle, I know it's very small, and at this point I would encourage you to just use your freehand. There's no real reason to take so much time to do it perfectly with a straight edge. It's small enough that it will work fine with a freehand. You know what Jean-Marc was saying earlier in the day about his work, when he works with a freehand. And the information is what's important, and the information is preserved by working freehand, and it's a lot faster, and quite frankly, it's more pleasant. So if you use a freehand instead of the ruler, you can draw the triangles, and you could draw like here. You could draw, a whole bunch of them. Draw like a ring of 6 triangles, and another ring of 6, and another. It'll only take you a minute to do that, or a minute and a half or less, and then you can extend those lines to the adjacent radius, and then it'll start making this star form in here, this 4-pointed star. And by the way, this inside, I should have shown it, but this is a 6-pointed star. So from this point to this point is establishing the 60-degree angle, like on the last one, right here. It's the same as this. And you can do that freehand as well. In this is a 6-pointed star. I should have shown it, I apologize. And here, another triangle. So it's 2 triangles. So if you draw, but you don't need to do the whole thing right now, but if you do 1 triangle and 2 or 3 1 hexagon with a 6-pointed star and 2 or 3 of the triangles, that's all the information you need to take this home and to then fill it in. And if you do that on one of these, then that panel can be just that design. If you then go to the next panel, like right here to the right of it, and draw in squares inside each square, squares and squares. Here we have triangles and triangles. If we put squares and squares, then we are establishing another nice layout that makes quite a lovely pattern. So I would suggest you do that. We need compasses to do these ones, and not everybody has compasses. So I'm sort of thinking that maybe you might sketch those quickly by hand if you want in the bottom left and bottom right. Or if you want instead on the bottom left and bottom right, you could do a 2-point pattern like this one right here, where you're just going across parallel to the sides of the square. Again, this one is dictated by the square. And you just go across and it creates this rather nice pattern, especially if you then put a hexagon inside. And that's a very successful pattern. And now I want to jump to this one here. This is a particularly nice pattern, and it's really pretty straightforward to make. If you turn to exercise 3, and do remember, this imagery will be available here at the Design Center, so you can refer to it. You can come back to it. And this one here is really pretty. It looks like it's going to be difficult, but it's one of the easiest ones, I would say. And what you're doing again, the main thing are the triangles. You're putting triangles and triangles, but the lines are going to extend across to this other triangle. And then you erase or you de-emphasize this area in here. But you can see how this line continues. This line continues across. But every single line is going through triangles. And triangles at each side. So this one here is going from the triangle all the way across. Well, actually, in this case, it's going to go down to a triangle down here. But these lines are all governed by the triangles. And it's basically, Reza was talking about 5 stars made with 10, 3. 10 being a decagon, 3 being 3 faces of the decagon that the line goes from midpoint to midpoint. So in this case, it's 12 because this is a dodecagon, and it's 12. And then how many units are you counting? You're going 1, 2, 3, 4. You're connecting. So this is a 12-4 star. So when you draw this one, exercise 3, is it 3? Yeah. When you draw exercise 3, you go from the midpoints of the decagon to the midpoint of the decagon, and you count 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you go from this one up to here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you go from this one to here, and you go 1, 2, 3, 4. And what you've done is you've made a big triangle. So because it's 12 and 3 goes into 12 4 times, you're going to do that 4 times. This is essentially, this star is made of 4 superimposed triangles, but then they've erased the center to emphasize this 12-pointed star. So it's really quite straightforward, but it's more than that. You don't just go from point to point. You want to go through the triangles, and in fact, you can go all the way across to this point here. See, look, that's one line all the way across, from midpoint to midpoint. So this is actually really quite an easy one to set up. But you want to remember 4 jumps for this line. 1, 2, 3, 4, right there. And then you just erase the inside section, easy enough to do. So this one it looks like this is going to be the most difficult, but actually this one is a very straightforward one. And just to mention, this is a very historical design that's used throughout the Muslim world by all Muslim cultures. You see it in Morocco and Spain. You see it in India. Certainly you see it here in Turkey. It's a very commonly used design, and the reason it's commonly used is clearly because it's a very beautiful design. So this one is quite straightforward. Remember, jumping 4 times. From here, you want to go to there. 1, 2, 3, 4. You know to connect these lines. And to connect them past. It's another way, if you're really getting into it, you know that you're going to cross to 2 radii. I've put these radii in here. And you're going to cross, when you draw when you draw from here to here, if you want to be more accurate and not have to do any erasing later, you can draw, instead of 1 line, you can draw 2 lines on the same ruler setting and cross to the second radii and cross to the second radii. Then that's leaving this gap. But you can deal with the gap later. You can just erase it or de-emphasize it by doing it really fine, really very thin line right now. And then when you've done all the lines, you can thicken the lines either by hand or coming across it with a straight edge and laying down more graphite to make it, to de-emphasize the light line. But all of this is you can do later, or you could even trace on top of it. If you do continuous lines, you could then trace on top of it if you wanted. I finish at 3, is that right?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, okay. Well, I'm going to, so I'm going to actually finish up because I don't want to run late. And we didn't get anywhere near, because you look how much more material I gave. So let me recap with something, okay? The first 4 sheets that I gave you that have all of the polygonal shapes on them, as I have said, those can be used to trace on top of, and it's really quick, it's really immediate, you'll be surprised. And these patterns can be made that way. You can find the dodecagon with this pattern inside of it, and you can trace on top of it, and then you can put the next dodecagon and trace on top of it, and it's remarkably fast. So I would encourage you to use those sheets, and then I'll flick forward. This is the 4-fold system A. You have a sheet of this. These pieces will all go together in many, well, infinite number of ways. These will go together. They make beautiful patterns. That's how you can make the shapes. We don't need to bother. This is a beautiful example from Afghanistan of a pattern made from the 4-fold system A. Here's more. That's that same pattern showing how it's made from just 3 elements. The octagon, the irregular pentagon, and this irregular hexagon. It's very nicely made. These are all historical patterns that can be made. This is showing the 4 family types, all 4 families, the acute, the median, the obtuse, and the 2-point patterns, all from the same grid. So this is a very flexible system. This does not have the flexibility, however, that the system of regular polygons, where there's so many ways to treat the lines. This is more rigid. This is more rigid. These are a series of patterns that don't have octagons, so they create what are called field patterns. So it's a field of elements rather than a focal point with 8-pointed star, like these. These have the 8-pointed stars. So there's so many systems. I'm going to run through these kind of quickly. This is a Moroccan variety. Also, this system works with these 2-level patterns. This example right here can easily be made by establishing a widened line with proportions that relate to the octagon, placing octagons around it. You get these little automatic interstice areas that are the shape of the pentagon. It just so happens it makes the pentagon. Then you can apply the line into it and get this final design. This Moroccan example is more complex. The original large-scale pattern is created from the system of the 4-fold system A. Then you populate the areas with octagons. You put the pattern into it. You populate with the secondary elements, and on it goes. This is all of the the dual-level patterns are all made with systems. They can't be made with non-systematic tiles. And that's the finished piece. It's very nice. Jean-Marc was showing this earlier. This is an exercise we don't have time for, but this will be here if you want to look at it to show how a nice pattern can be made. This is the system B, 4-fold system B. Look, it's much fewer parts, many fewer parts. Not as many tessellations tend to be made, but a huge number of patterns in the history of Islamic geometric design are made from this system. These are all historic examples. This is how they're derived, you can see. This is quite a simple way to make patterns. Once you apply yourself for a little while, it gets more and more natural, It becomes quite straightforward. These are all historic examples, as are these from the 4-fold B. And I want to just quickly run through, the 5-fold system. The 5-fold system has each of the 4 families again, the acute family, the median family, the obtuse family, and the 2-point family. There are quite a number of pieces to this family. As you can see, when Peter Liu and Paul Steinhardt published their paper, they only identified 5 of the pieces, and they only identified this family. They didn't identify these, although they had access to my paper that I published some years before them. They only focused on this limited set. But it's a much greater set than if you only use the shapes that they have advocated, you end up kind of making the same kind of pattern all the time. It was not, I mean, it has the same aesthetic quality. It's a different pattern, but the same aesthetic quality. But when you start working with the other families as well, you have much more diversity and fun, quite frankly. They can all be made very simply from the decagon. This is some steps for tessellating with them, for rectangular tessellations and rhombic tessellations. The different ways of doing infill. I should have asked to do two programs with you all. And so I'll flick through these. This is a historic acute pattern. This is a historic median pattern. This is a historic obtuse pattern. And here's a historic two-point pattern. And each of these is made from the same underlying tessellation. Each of these is derived. This rhombus, the information that creates this pattern is the same underlying information that creates this pattern and this pattern and this pattern. This is all four of the same, this is all four families using the same generative tessellation.
The fourth picture is in which country?
Mamluk, Egypt. Although you see beautiful work like that from Turkey too. In fact, I think it was made in Egypt under Ottoman influence. I'm not sure. That's showing the construction of those four examples with the underlying grids. Here's some field patterns. That's an interesting complex Seljuk pattern from Turkey. The tenfold system can also create 20-pointed stars. It's not done too often, but it's sometimes done. This piece is from Mamluk Egypt. I'm sorry, Seljuk, Turkey. And then these fivefold systems will also make dual level designs. We've talked about this earlier. This is from my paper in 2003. It was basically republished with slight changes by Steinhardt and Liu without credit. The population of the cells, the pattern cells, is done in a edge length fashion. The shortest edge length you start with for convenience, and then that automatically allows for the secondary edge lengths. You can see short edge, long edge, and radius, and they all fall into place very conveniently with the system. That's why it's a system. It's a system. It means that it just works again and again and again. It always works. It's really beautiful. Then you populate the whole piece, you put the pattern lines in, and you get a finished piece like this. That's from the Darbi Imam in Iran. And then this is a Moroccan two-point. It's a repetitive element. I'll just flip through because we really need to finish, but that's the finished piece. And that's an exercise, but we can't do it. And then quickly, I just want to end by showing you the sevenfold system. Sevenfold system, Gusan was showing you some examples, and it's actually a really cool system, but it's hardly ever used. It was used by the Mamluks principally. There are earlier Seljuk examples like the one that Gusan showed us, and there are some Turkish Seljuk examples, 3, made from the same system. This is showing 2 of the elements, just the regular 7-gon and the regular 14-gon in each of the families. Then there are a group of secondary elements. The secondary elements, this hexagon right here is one of the ones that Gusan was working with. And this pentagon is one of the secondary elements in the Seljuk Turkish pieces. And there are these. There are so many. That's why I didn't put it on a sheet. You can see there's so many pieces. So these are 4 pieces. I showed these the other day. This is Seljuk Turkish. This is Seljuk Turkish. This is Seljuk Turkish. They were all made within 35 years of each other in central Anatolia, and they are all made from this rather lovely simple grid of regular heptagons. And this one is one of my own, but made from the same, because I couldn't find a historical example of the median pattern. Then these are some quick 7-fold system patterns. These are one is from Samarkand and the other is from Turkey. And they use these elements from the 7-fold system very beautifully. This is to demonstrate something. This is one of my own patterns. This is a door here the Bayezid Pasha Mosque here in Turkey. It's made from this sevenfold grid. So the sevenfold system is really cool. Look at, I mean, this is a beautiful piece from Egypt. It's very, very beautiful, but it's hardly used. The images I'm showing right now, here's another one from Palestine, from Hebron. The ones that I'm showing you right now, almost every one that I've been able to find in the historic record. One more, and there's one more after this. No, this is the last one. And so that's like it. It's like in the history of Islamic art, that's almost every single sevenfold system pattern. It wasn't widely distributed throughout the Islamic world like the fivefold system and the fourfold systems were. It seemed to have only been known by a few people. And so we're not going to go into non-systematic, and I'll let you all go, but you do have one non-systematic piece, exercise 7, and you can refer to, because as I've said, I'm leaving this behind, and you can flick forward and see how these were made and how you can, you have some variation here and different pattern types on the same grid, 2-point, and here's some historical, there's a whole bunch in here. So you might want to, I can't keep you longer because it wouldn't be fair to the next presenter. So if you have some leisure time and you want to look at what I've prepared, it will be available for you to view as this PowerPoint. Okay, thank you very much.